The person you're most afraid of becoming is the person you already are underneath everything you've built to hide it. Carl Jung arrived at this conclusion not through philosophy or spiritual theory, but through years of watching patients destroy themselves, trying to avoid a version of themselves that was trying to save them. The identity they were running from wasn't dangerous. It wasn't dark. It was just real. And that realness terrified them more than any external threat ever could. Jung found that the most exhausted, anxious, depressed people he treated shared something strange in common. They weren't suffering because life had been cruel to them, though many had experienced genuine hardship. They were suffering because they'd spent years, sometimes decades, performing a version of themselves that contradicted who they actually were, and the energy required to maintain that performance was eating them alive from the inside out. Their symptoms weren't signs of illness. They were signs of a self trying to break through a wall the person had spent their whole life building. Today I'm going to show you what Jung discovered about the person you're afraid to become, why that fear is actually the most important signal your psyche is sending you, and what happens when you finally stop running from the version of yourself you've been hiding since childhood. Because Jung believed that everything you want, everything you've been searching for, exists on the other side of the identity you've been too afraid to claim. To understand why we're terrified of our own authenticity, you have to understand what Jung observed about how identity forms in the first place. He watched it happen in patient after patient. A child is born with certain natural qualities, certain instincts, certain ways of being in the world that are genuinely theirs. Maybe they're intense, maybe they're quiet and observant, maybe they're fiercely independent, maybe they're emotionally expressive in ways that fill a room. Whatever those qualities are, they're authentic, they're the raw material of the real self. Then the environment responds, and that response teaches the child which parts of themselves are acceptable and which parts need to disappear. The intense child is told they're too much. The quiet child is told to speak up, be more social, stop being so serious. The independent child is punished for not needing others enough. The emotionally expressive child is shamed for being dramatic or oversensitive. It doesn't take long. Within a few years, the child has learned exactly which version of themselves earns love and which version gets rejected. Jung called the acceptable version the persona, the mask you wear to navigate the world safely. And he emphasized that the persona isn't inherently unhealthy. Everyone needs one. You can't walk around completely unfiltered in every situation. The problem arises when the persona becomes the only self you know. When you've been wearing the mask so long, you've forgotten there's a face underneath it. When you've performed the acceptable version so thoroughly that the real self feels like a stranger, or worse, like a threat. This is where the fear begins, because the real self didn't disappear. It went underground. Jung called this the shadow, and he meant something specific by it. The shadow isn't your evil twin. It isn't the worst version of you. It's every quality, every impulse, every authentic expression that got exiled because it wasn't welcome. Your anger went into the shadow if anger wasn't allowed. Your ambition went there if you were taught that wanting things was selfish. Your sexuality, your creativity, your need for solitude, your desire to be seen, your fierce opinions, your tenderness, whatever wasn't acceptable in your family system, got pushed down into the shadow where it lived in exile, accumulating energy, waiting. And here's what Jung discovered that changes everything about how we understand fear. The person you're afraid to become isn't some hypothetical future self. It's the exiled self. It's the collection of authentic qualities that got rejected in childhood, now pressing against the walls of the persona, demanding to be lived. The fear you feel isn't about something bad happening. It's about something real happening, and your entire psychological system has been trained to treat realness as danger. Think about someone who grew up in a household where emotional expression was treated as weakness. They learned early that showing feelings meant being ridiculed, dismissed, or punished. So, they built a persona around emotional control. They became the calm one, the rational one, the person who never loses it. And they've spent 20 or 30 years perfecting this performance, earning respect for their composure, building an identity around being unshakable. Now their real self, the one that feels deeply and needs to express those feelings, starts pushing through. Maybe they find themselves crying unexpectedly. Maybe they feel rage they can't explain. Maybe they're drawn to art or music or writing that requires emotional vulnerability. And instead of recognizing this as their authentic self emerging, they're terrified. They interpret it as breaking down, losing control, becoming weak. Because their entire identity was built on the premise that feeling deeply is dangerous, and now feelings are flooding through the cracks in their armor. Jung saw this pattern constantly. The person afraid of their own anger was sitting on a lifetime of suppressed boundaries. The person afraid of their own ambition had been taught that wanting more was greedy. The person afraid of their own sexuality had learned that desire was shameful. The person afraid of being alone had never been allowed to discover who they were outside of others' needs. In every case, the feared self wasn't destructive. It was the missing piece, the quality that, once integrated, would make them whole. But integration requires something most people aren't prepared for. It requires letting the persona crack. It requires allowing others to see you as something other than what you've always performed. It requires tolerating the discomfort of being perceived differently by people who only know the mask. And this is where Jung found most people got stuck. Not because they couldn't access their authentic self, but because the cost of revealing it felt unsurvivable. The cost is real. Jung never minimized this. When you start becoming who you actually are, you will lose people. Not because you're doing something wrong, but because some relationships only exist because of the persona. They were built on your performance. The friend who loves how agreeable you are won't love the version of you that says no. The partner who's comfortable with your emotional flatness won't know what to do when you start expressing real feelings. The family that rewards your compliance will panic when you start setting boundaries. These losses aren't hypothetical, they're guaranteed, and they're the reason most people stay trapped in the persona for their entire lives. Jung understood that the fear of becoming yourself is actually the fear of losing the world you built as someone else. You're not afraid of your authentic self in isolation. You're afraid of what happens to your relationships, your career, your social standing, your family dynamics when you stop performing the version everyone's comfortable with. You're afraid of the grief, the conflict, the rejection, the aloneness that comes with dropping the mask. And that fear is rational. The consequences are real. But Jung also observed something that his patients discovered only after they'd been forced into transformation, usually through crisis. The world you lose when you become yourself wasn't actually yours. It belonged to the persona. The relationships that can't survive your authenticity weren't real connections. They were arrangements based on your performance. The approval you earned through compliance wasn't love. It was a transaction, And the identity that felt so solid, so necessary, so impossible to survive without, was actually the prison keeping you from the life that was genuinely yours. Before we continue, check out our new guide, True Self-Discovery, with 24 practical reflection exercises inspired by the teachings of Carl Jung, designed to help you find your way within. Click below to get true self-discovery. Jung described the process of becoming yourself as a kind of death, and he meant it. The persona has to die for the real self to live. The old identity has to dissolve. The familiar ways of relating, coping, performing have to fall apart. And this dissolution feels exactly like dying, because psychologically it is. The self you've known your entire life is ending, and the self that's emerging is someone you've never been allowed to be, which means that you have no reference point for how to live as that person. You're stepping into unknown territory with no map. This is why so many people experience their greatest transformation during their worst crisis. Jung observed that the psyche often orchestrates breakdowns when the gap between persona and authentic self becomes too wide. The depression that won't lift, the anxiety that medication can't touch, the relationship that implodes despite everything you've done to hold it together, the career success that feels hollow despite all the external markers of achievement. These aren't random catastrophes. They're the authentic self refusing to stay buried any longer. Jung called this the call to individuation, and he noticed that most people experience it as destruction rather than invitation. Because from the persona's perspective, it is destruction. Everything the persona built is being threatened. But from the authentic self's perspective, it's liberation. The prison walls are finally coming down. The question is whether you can survive the demolition long enough to see what's on the other side. What's on the other side is something Jung described with a word that sounds simple but carries enormous weight. Wholeness, not perfection, not happiness, not some elevated spiritual state. Wholeness. The experience of being all of who you are, rather than the carefully curated fraction you've been presenting to the world. Wholeness includes your darkness and your light, your strength and your vulnerability, your ambition and your tenderness, your need for others and your need for solitude. Everything that was split off and exiled gets welcomed back. And Jung found that wholeness produces something the persona never could: genuine vitality, because the persona requires constant energy to maintain. You're always monitoring, adjusting, performing, calculating what version of yourself is needed in this moment. That surveillance never stops. It runs in the background of every interaction, every decision, every quiet moment. And it's exhausting in a way that can't be solved by rest, because the exhaustion isn't physical. It's the fatigue of being someone you're not, every single day, for decades. When people began integrating their shadow, claiming the exiled parts of themselves, Jung watched the exhaustion lift. Not because their lives got easier. Often their external lives got harder during the transition. But their internal experience shifted fundamentally. The energy that had been consumed by performance became available for living. The vitality that had been trapped underneath the mask flooded into their actual existence. They described feeling alive in ways they hadn't experienced since childhood, before they learned to hide. But Jung was honest about what this aliveness looked like from the outside. It didn't look polished. It didn't look like they'd figured everything out. It looked raw, unfinished, sometimes messy. The person who'd been performing composure their whole life might go through a period of intense emotionality as decades of suppressed feeling surfaced. The person who'd been performing niceness might become confrontational as their buried anger finally found expression. The person who had been performing smallness might become almost uncomfortably ambitious as their real desires emerged. This is the phase that terrifies people most, because it confirms exactly what they feared. They're becoming different. People are reacting. The world they knew is shifting, and they can't go back to the persona because now they've seen through it. They know the mask is a mask. They can feel the falseness of the old performance. They're caught between an identity they can no longer inhabit and one they haven't fully grown into yet. Jung called this liminality, and he considered it the most dangerous and most transformative phase of psychological development. Dangerous because people in liminal space are vulnerable. They have lost the protection of the persona without yet having the grounding of the integrated self. They can be pulled back into old patterns by fear. They can be shamed back into performance by people who need the old version. They can lose nerve and rebuild the mask stronger than before, burying the authentic self even deeper. Jung saw patients do this. They'd touch authenticity, get frightened by the consequences, and retreat into an even more rigid version of the persona. And that retreat was devastating, because now they knew what they were hiding from, which made the hiding unbearable, but transformative because the people who stayed in the liminal space, who tolerated the discomfort of being between identities, who resisted the pull to go back, eventually broke through into something new. Not a new persona, not another performance, an actual self. One that didn't need to be maintained through constant vigilance because it wasn't a construction. It was just who they were. Jung noticed specific qualities in people who'd completed this passage. They weren't trying to be anything. There was an absence of performance that was almost startling. They could be in a room full of people and not adjust themselves to match what was expected. They could disagree without aggression and agree without submission. They could be tender without apologizing for it and fierce without performing dominance. They were, for the first time, simply present as themselves. This simplicity was the endpoint of the most complex psychological work a person can do. And Jung found it ironic that the result of so much internal struggle was something that looked effortless from the outside. People who had integrated their shadow didn't appear to be doing anything special. They just seemed real, grounded, available, like there was someone actually home when you looked in their eyes. And here's what Jung emphasized about the fear that precedes this transformation. The fear is accurate about the losses. You will lose relationships. You will lose your old identity. You will go through a period that feels like psychological death. You will be misunderstood by people who need you to stay the same. All of that is true, and pretending otherwise would be dishonest. But the fear is completely wrong about one thing. It tells you that what's on the other side of the persona is worse than what's inside it. It tells you that the authentic self is dangerous, shameful, too much, not enough, unlovable. And that is the lie. The lie was installed in childhood by people who couldn't handle your realness, people who needed you to be smaller, quieter, more convenient, less intense, more compliant. Their rejection of your authentic qualities wasn't evidence that those qualities were wrong. It was evidence that those people couldn't tolerate them, and you built an entire identity around the premise that their intolerance was your flaw. Jung would tell you to re-examine every quality you've exiled, every part of yourself you've been afraid of, every impulse you've suppressed, every desire you've denied, every expression you've stifled. Ask yourself honestly, was this exiled because it's genuinely harmful or because someone couldn't handle it? In almost every case Jung found, the answer was the latter. The real self wasn't rejected because it was bad. It was rejected because it was inconvenient, because it threatened someone else's control, comfort, or worldview. And you've been treating that rejection as a life sentence. The person you're afraid to become is the person your psyche has been trying to deliver you to your entire life. Every bout of depression that wouldn't lift was the authentic self pressing against the persona. Every anxiety attack was the energy of suppressed qualities trying to surface. Every feeling of emptiness, despite external success, was the hollow center where your real self should have been, but wasn't allowed to exist. Jung believed that the single most courageous act a human being can perform is to become who they actually are, not who their parents needed them to be, not who their culture rewards them for being, not who their trauma shaped them into, but who they are underneath all of it. The person who was there before the mask was built. The person who's been waiting, sometimes for decades, to finally be allowed to live. That person is the one you're afraid of. And that fear, Jung would say, is the most important compass you have, because what you're most afraid to become is almost always what you most need to become. The qualities you've spent your life suppressing are the exact qualities required for your wholeness. The identity you've been avoiding is the identity that would actually fit. The self you've been hiding is the self that could finally, for the first time, feel like home. You don't have to become this person all at once. You don't have to announce it or prove it or perform it for anyone. You just have to stop running from it. Stop treating your authentic impulses as threats. Stop interpreting the cracking of the persona as breakdown when it's actually breakthrough. Stop believing the childhood message that your real self is too much or not enough. That message was never about you. It was about the limitations of the people who raised you, and carrying it forward as truth is the betrayal of yourself that Jung spent his career trying to help people recognize and end. The person you're afraid to be is not your enemy. That person is you, and the fear you feel isn't a warning to stay away. It's the trembling that happens right before you finally come home to yourself. Everything you've been searching for, the peace, the vitality, the sense of meaning, the relationships that actually feel real, exists in the identity you've been avoiding, not because the universe is hiding it from you, but because you've been hiding from it. And the moment you stop hiding, the moment you let the mask fall and stand in the raw, uncomfortable, terrifying truth of who you actually are, is the moment your real life begins. Jung spent his entire career pointing people toward this threshold, not pushing them across it, because no one can do that for you, but standing at the edge with them, saying, "What you're afraid of is what will save you." The person you cannot bear to become is the person you cannot bear to live without being. And the only thing more painful than the transformation is spending your entire life refusing it. If you haven't yet, check out our new guide, True Self-Discovery, with 24 practical reflection exercises inspired by the teachings of Carl Jung, designed to help you find your way within. Click below to get True Self-Discovery.